Thanks for joining us today for this Saturate webinar. My name is Ben Conley, and we are thrilled to be having this conversation. If you weren't part of part one of this conversation, Atanasio and Kendrick and Sam and myself had a conversation in early June when across U.S. culture, across the world, the theme of ethnic injustice was having an overt spotlight shined on it. It felt very much in every single news cycle and that kind of stuff. And so we had a conversation, brought different perspectives, learned from each other around the theme of how the gospel leads us in a biblical pursuit of justice, especially around this idea of ethnicity and race. And as we were praying, talking with a couple of these brothers and talking with some friends over the summer, the danger in having a conversation like that in that moment is it feels similar in some ways to when you lose a loved one, a close loved one, where, you know, if you've had that experience, you know, like people surround you in the first days and weeks after that, and everybody is sympathetic and everybody wants to bring food and support you and this kind of stuff. And you're so grateful for that. And yet, as 2 weeks go by, 2 months go by, it just seems like the sympathy goes away, the support goes away, and this kind of stuff. And that's been something that's long been felt among persons of color around our country. It's been something that's long been felt around this theme of gospel and racial ethnic tension and injustice. And while we're still seeing pictures of it in the news, while we're still experiencing pieces of it, there's part of me, frankly, that has wondered, would things have gone back to normal if it didn't keep happening? And of course, there's a ton of brokenness in the fact that it keeps happening at all. But there's even more brokenness if that's the only reason that it's staying on our hearts and on our minds and this kind of stuff. And so we wanted to guard against even the possibility of people, quote unquote, going back to normal. And I even realized the loadedness of that phrase. And do so by continuing the conversation that we had in June. And so these three guys were willing to get the band back together, as it were, and we're having webinar part 2 today on the gospel and racial injustice, and just talking about what's gone on in the last 3 months. What's it look like 3 months later? So Sam Choi is in Minneapolis, the ground zero of some of, not all of, but some of what put all of this in the spotlight back in May. Kendrick Banks is in Dallas, and Atanasio Segovia is in Leon, Mexico. So thank you guys for having this conversation again, and good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Morning. It's good to be here. Love you guys.
Yeah,
I do this for free instead of the an immense amount of money you guys are paying us to be on this.
That's right.
I haven't got my check yet, so.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. Well, I'll
Must have gotten, it's probably clearing customs. That's an SEO, so we'll coming. Let me pray for us, gentlemen, and we'll dive in. So, Father, I do thank you that you are the God of all peoples. I thank you that you break down every dividing wall, God. I thank you that it's your it's your compassion and your kindness that leads us to compassion and kindness, and it's your grace that enables us to show grace, and it's your heart for calling yourself a people and seeking to help those who can't help themselves, that we see reflected in Jesus' pursuit of us, that we all recognize in Jesus' pursuit of us, that is the starting point for our conversation. And so I pray that you would, even as we prayed before folks started jumping on, would you use this brief time together to produce disproportionate fruit?
Yes, Lord.
And would you shape our hearts and shape our minds? And at the end of the day, would this be about you? Would we be worshipers of you? And would that be what flows out of this? In all the different things that then would lead us to. Would you shape our hearts, God? It's in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, let's start with this. Again, we had a conversation three months ago. What have you seen? What have you experienced over the last 3 months in your churches and cities, and maybe especially within the Christian world? Let's just kind of start there. Yeah, what have your churches been doing? What have you been doing? What have you been seeing? What have you been feeling? So, Sam, would you mind, since you were, again, ground zero Minneapolis in May, would you start us?
Yeah, so there's been obviously a huge spike of interest in thinking through racial issues You can see that locally in our city with tons of protests and lots of churches talking about it. As a result, you're seeing a lot of polarization. One of our mother churches, or sorry, grandma church, Bethlehem Baptist, has a number of people leaving because they're not going far enough with social issues. And then others who are leaving because they're accusing the pastors of compromising into the social gospel, so not doing enough. I think I see that across the spectrum in a lot of churches. It's either or. You're doing too much, you're doing too little. And there's been a lot of, there's been a few initiatives between local churches. I could get into that later if you guys like. We partner with a local historically Black church and been doing a lot of things together. But it seems that that's teetered away. There's for sure racial fatigue or fatigue over this whole issue. But there's been an uptick again of interest because we had looting and riots last week over a situation in downtown Minneapolis. So that's right back on everyone's radar again. And obviously with Kenosha just being one state over, things going down in Portland, breaking down, and all across the country. Last night, LA, there's a big thing going on in LA. So you can't ignore it right now, but definitely the fatigue set in and then now it's up again, but people I think are just tired and over it. So we're trying to do certain things, but that's been kind of what's going on in, at least in Minneapolis. Memorial is still going strong. There's still events and stuff regularly, but it's just, I think a lot of people just went back to normal life. But especially the Black community have not moved on as they ought not to, as seen last week with the man who committed suicide. There were some people around who swore that the cop shot him. Video evidence showed that he shot himself, but immediately that information spread like wildfire and looting just happened like that. So that shows that we're on this tension, this precipice that one thing can set everything ablaze quickly. And the ramp up last time when everything happened with George Floyd, it took a couple of days to ramp up before the 3rd precinct was burned down and destroyed and everything. When it was just a few hours before people start destroying, and I think over 50 businesses were affected, burned, looted. So it's interesting how quick it elevates right now. So that just shows that the tension is just building.
Yeah, fair. And thanks for the view from Minneapolis. What about you other two guys? What are you seeing, experiencing?
It seems that we are bad at disagreeing about things as a culture and in the church. And there's different ways that I've seen that kind of come about. I'm not with pandemic and with being new to Dallas, there's not been time to really connect deeply with the local church, but we are connected to several in the area. But the one in particular that we've been, I guess, attending virtually the most is a Disciple City, and their leaders have done a really good job, I think, of keeping things in the forefront. It helps that they're planted as a multi-ethnic church in the middle of a predominantly brown and Black part of town, but they have really sought the Lord, and in Scripture they immediately stopped and made space for lamenting, which is a missing discipline in the church. But we lament because we're honest about the brokenness, and we're dependent on God. And then straight into a panel discussion and a series on justice, which a lot of people have done in this season. But now there's this formation of a committee that would be people who only focus on these issues, while ministry is going to be diverse and it needs to be. These issues are always present. And unfortunately, things like rioting and looting is what gets at attention. And as that attention starts to dissipate and rhythms return back to whatever normal is, those things keep happening. So I'm not trying to give anything a moral description that I'm seeing in the news or wherever. I just want to try to understand where it's coming from. And I think that is a good role the church can take on as missiologists, kind of just understanding where society is intersecting our history and our sins, and what the gospel has to say about those things. And not spending so much time denying reality or injustice, which unfortunately is coming out of the church in large part, and demonizing the opposition, which we're not battling against people here. We're battling against something far stronger, and then derailing and distracting by using trigger language or focusing on the wrong or making it more abstract or ambiguous when there's reason to be very particular and very specific right now. I'm all for balance. We need to have balance, but justice means that we're going to focus on one thing right now so that we can have equality eventually. And our ultimate hope isn't here anyway. So it's still complex and it's still exhausting and we're still moving forward. That's kind of where I've been.
Man, it's a lot there. South of the border here, it's really interesting because, I mean, whatever happens in the States, I'm guessing the whole world talks about it. I'm not talking about anything in China or I don't know, Zimbabwe, right? What's happening in the U.S. church and in the U.S. by large permeates into conversations down here. And I am seeing that polarizing of the church. And I'm also noticing who gets to influence the Latino church or Mexican church in particular. And my worry is that it's a very conservative branch of American Christianity. And I would say at the cost of voices from our African-American brothers or Asian-American brothers and so forth. So for me, the challenge that I'm in is that what's happening in the States is coming down to Mexico, and we're taking a lot of that and making it gospel. Like, this is how we're supposed to be dealing with things. So, and here we're, you know, there's a huge issue with anything social gospel, social anything. So there's a lot of slandering as well happening if you kind of don't follow the main narrative of particular, you know, leaders in the States. So my concern is that the U.S. sneeze, now we're going to catch a cold for the next, you know, generation or so.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. That's not from your perspective as you follow what's going on in the States. Have outside of kind of some, you know, new occurrences of a similar theme. Have we moved on? Have our news cycle moved on? Have the things that are being kind of exported, you know, by and large moved into just, you know, election season and racial tension is the thing of the past from your perspective, or is it still pretty high on the radar?
Compared to 3 months ago, the news cycle has moved on. Like, something happened, it was all over the place, and now it's died down. The thing that is left over is the echo within the small evangelical community down here of the gospel socialists tendencies and stuff like that. But by large, yes, it's moved on. Magic happened. It does nothing. Something happened within 3 months and then it's gone. So that's kind of like the perspective, because there's not a lot of news cycles about it.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful context, I think. And I want to ask kind of a similar question, but nuance it a little bit as you think back over the last 3 months to where we stay. And again, we're not sociologists. We're not, you know, any of us expert cultural exegetes, but we all have experiences and we all have the Spirit of God in us who opens our eyes to things going on with us. Like what are you seeing that's encouraging and what are you seeing that's discouraging? And I'll start this one for me. I see some of what's already been mentioned as a real encouragement that there are pockets of the church, pockets of society as well, but we're talking about pockets of the church here that are not willing to let things go and are not willing to say, let's go back to normal. And yes, I know that for the white church, white evangelical church, to use that broad stereotypical kind of framework, that's probably too late coming in a lot of people's eyes, and there's regret in that for sure. And yet it is something that folks are willing to step into and not let go in some pockets. And so that's encouraging. I've heard from folks that they find that to be encouraging as well. Understandable. There's some, you know, trepidation of like, is it just a trend? Is it going to go away? And this kind of stuff. So I get that as well. So it's discouraging that history has brought us to that point where even some well-meaning attempts, you know, have some rightful question to them about their longevity. And I think another discouragement is it seemed like some churches, you know, did the equivalent. This is totally generalizing, but some churches or pastors or evangelical leaders kind of made a statement within the first couple of weeks, and then like, okay, we did our part. Now let's move on. Here's our piece. You can't accuse us of not caring about this because we said something. And that's been kind of discouraging to see. And certainly people are all along the spectrum between those two, but that is some encouragement and discouragement that I felt in this. And I'm curious to know about you guys?
I am not very encouraged overall. I'm encouraged in the hope of the gospel and what Jesus is going to ultimately do, and he's doing behind the scenes that I can't even see. So I'm not despairing, but I'm discouraged. I'm discouraged. So many churches are divided. My heart breaks so much. My heart is enlarged. God has enlarged my heart for the church, and seeing how many churches are dividing over this and fighting. We're being exposed to how unable, how inept we are at being able to disagree charitably and listen to each other well. It just really concerns me. I'm discouraged by the amount of Christians in Minneapolis who are moving and fleeing the cities to go live in the suburbs, when it feels like this is the time we should be here. This is our opportunity to be the church in Rome when, you know, the plague hits and everyone leaves. I feel like we have the opportunity to stay and be a light. I'm really discouraged by that. I'm discouraged about the how many staunch Republican friends that I have who feel like the greatest enemy to the church is socialism. They feel like that is the greatest enemy we have to fight. And kind of touching with Kendrick said earlier, you know, we're wrestling against not against flesh and blood. And it feels like people think that that's the great enemy is Biden and Kamala or other situations, or BLM or something like that, on the very right side. And on the left side, I'm really discouraged by how many friends who have really taken on the banner of justice, but they don't talk about Jesus anymore. Like literally, like all they post about is the latest shooting, the latest thing, and they never talk about Jesus anymore. When they used to talk about, share Bible verses and about how beautiful Jesus is and what he's doing. And it's only about justice. And we can't dichotomize justice. Jesus as the just justice, the ultimate judge, and how he cares about that. And yet the God of grace and the God that does all these other things. And so it just feels like naturally we as humans aren't good at, Kendra used the word balance, and I don't know the right word, but balance maybe for lack of better terminology, and holding both. And they don't talk about anything else but that, as if that's the only thing going on in the world and that's the only thing that Jesus cares about. And that just shows a sense of immaturity, where it's like, and maybe they're trying to keep up with everything, and maybe there's some white guilt trying to drive them to show how in they are. I don't know all the motivations, but it concerns me that in doing this, in trying to be faithful to Jesus, where some of my friends are forgetting Jesus. That discourages me. Yeah.
I think for me, I always have a hard time answering questions because I want to like think about all the definitions of all the words I'm using. But I think that I wouldn't use the word discourage. I feel what you're saying, Sam, in a lot of ways. But I might say that I am exhausted, or I'm frustrated, or I am, I guess, mostly I'm burdened. I don't know that I feel discouraged though, because obviously, like you mentioned when you started, there's this ultimate hope. Jesus will make all things right. I think justice is so much a part of his character that you can't know him. You can't know God if you don't know justice. He is just God. And so I have a lot of hope when I think ultimately, but I even have some like more present and near hope just when I see, despite the chaos and the divisions and all that, I just know his faithfulness in the moment, in the present. And I have moments of peace that don't make any sense, just like he told me I would have. And so when I look at young people in particular, I know I'm young, so it's weird to say that, but when I look at young people in particular, I see this zeal and this intentionality and this courage to address things that in the past we would just accept as indoctrination, or you can't challenge that, which is more of a cult than it is a faith. And so whether or not they're right is something we follow up on, but the fact that there's that courage to say what needs to be said, and even some seeking wisdom that hasn't always been done, I'm seeing more of that because people are being humbled by the reality that this is out of our control. And I think overall it's going to be healthy for the church. I think maybe some of the people leaving might need to be weeded out. And I'm obviously not the one who makes that decision, but that's where I trust God's faithfulness. So I don't feel discouraged. I just wouldn't use that word. But I am burdened and I am exhausted by some of the ways that people are pushing back. And I mentioned that earlier. Just it's the same things, and I feel like we need to be much further along in the conversation. And even when you're only talking about justice, I'm not even discouraged by that, because there's a lack of talk about justice. So let's have those people do that, and then that's where we need other people to come in. We need to be sharing leadership. I don't think any one person I've listened to or read or heard from, I would say you've got it all. You're figuring it all out. You're saying all the things you need to be saying. There's always something missing, which draws us together. And so the season is not great. The season is a difficult season, but I don't find it to be a discouraging one necessarily.
Yeah, just to add to that, after darkness, light. And I think right now we're going through that season. I think God is shaking a lot of things. And he's trying to speak very loudly and clearly to his church in particular. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by what might come afterwards. Although we're in a painful season right now, from what I see in church history, after this, something will happen. So I'm encouraged to see what that something will be. At the same time, it's encouraging to me from the outside looking in, because the American church is having a conversation that would not happen in Mexico ever. We don't even have the framework to talk about those things yet. We have a lot of racism. It permeates throughout the culture, but there's no concept of actual justice. How do we address it? So being able to see the church, although it's painful to see it, go through a lot of the pruning and a lot of refining, I'm excited that is happening, that you guys are having that conversation. And I long for the day that can happen in the Mexican church, where we can talk about the problems we have internally. But so I'm encouraged by that. Painful to see at the same time, but it's this weird thing of it's awesome, but it's painful at the same time.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think kind of maybe last kind of looking back question, and for those who are watching, the four of us kind of batted around a few kind of questions and themes, a little behind the scenes on Saturate webinars. We talked about a few things to discuss. And one of the questions was, what is the pre-pain normal that folks are settling into? But I kind of want to broaden it from that a little bit and say, like, is there such a thing? Like, is there an ability for folks who have either experienced suffering, or for folks who have repented, or for folks who are stepping into this? Is it even possible for folks to think of a pre-pain normal? And if so, what's being settled into? But if not, like, what does a new normal look like?
New normal, ideally, or new normal actually?
Let's go with eschatological hopeful new normal. Yeah, no, it's both and. Like, what is ideal, and then what? Maybe a little bit of compare contrast, Sam. Are you seeing people step into that ideal?
Can you expound where you're going with the pain aspect?
Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of again overt pain that wasn't new, right? And we've all acknowledged that. I think across culture that's being acknowledged. It was rather like an overt moment or an acute moment of this ongoing subtle pain. And so again, if we're trying to guard against this conversation just fading, or even to the point it's already made, somehow separating Jesus from justice, as if those two things are not in the same boat. What is the pre-pain normal that folks could settle into? Or have we moved so far as a culture that it's not even possible to think of a pre-pain normal? Is that clarifying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'd love for someone else to answer first.
I think that, so the last time we talked about retributive justice, retribution, restorative justice, and we kind of kicked those around a little bit, and I think a lot of that's connected to how our society has influenced us in the church in ways that maybe we're not aware. So when we think about justice, we naturally kind of think of God's going to condemn people, like he's sending people to hell. But but we see biblically that things seem to lean more towards the fact that Jesus restores things, and I think that that's a more hopeful focus. But recently, I've been looking into this new understanding of transformative justice, where it's not just that Jesus is restoring things, which we want restoration, but it's a new thing he's doing, and it's a better thing that he's doing. Redemption is better than the perfection of the garden somehow. And so
It's good
that when we consider like even reconciliation, the racial reconciliation idea requires justice to have it. And that's become a more common topic of or focus in that topic. But when we think about justice, even there needs to be this leaning towards creating a space, a culture that's grace is the theme, and that the wrongs that require justice are happening less. And so when we settle back into something, it's the status quo, it's the normal thing, and we drift downstream. You know, we have to be intentional to work against the currents of the culture. And so that's going to require us to not go back to anything, that we're constantly moving forward. We're working through the pain, through understanding trauma as it affects individuals, and not just the victims, but the victimizer, and doing that corporately as well, and understanding history and sociology. There's so much that's required of pastors and missionaries in our culture that we can't limit it to, just what we've always done, just who the church has always been, because it's necessary. Justice requires we examine the wrongdoings in the past, the current situation, and how it's going to lead to more wrongdoings, and have hope for the future. And we can't do that without Jesus. So it's problematic to think there's something to be settled into. But what I'm seeing is the only people who really think that that's okay are people who are further away from the pain. And so I think that's where pain plays into it. The people who have been really hurt and maybe are just now seeing it. And that's what trauma is. Like, you didn't realize it, but you experienced a lot of suffering. Those people have nothing to go back to. There's nothing to settle back into. And the church is leaving these people behind, or these people are leaving the church. And so it's imperative that we examine it and try to figure out what the way forward is, and not try to go backwards.
Yeah. I think a key is to not allow the news cycle or the media or politicians to tell us what we should feel or think regarding these issues. So we're preaching through the Gospel of Luke. We're almost halfway through, and Jesus just shows over and over again this pattern of moving into brokenness and pain. And I think if our people are regularly engaging the community, this pain will be felt. They don't need to let CNN or some other news agency or organization to show an interview or show a stat or something for us to enter into pain. If we are incarnating ourselves into our community, we're going to see this pain with a face. Stats, you don't feel pain with stats, really. We are callous towards stats. But if you regularly, so our church gathers at MLK Park on Sundays, and our MC meets there too. And we're just regularly encountering people. And so there's one girl, her name is Coretta, and she's 15, and she lives in North Minneapolis, and she always stays home. She's a Black girl with, broken family, and she stays at home because she's terrified of going outside. Right? That's pain. That's real pain. I have her face in my mind. We have her number now. And that lets me not forget these realities. And so I think as much as our people are insulating themselves and just going to the status quo and just, sticking within our bubbles, we're going to only enter into the pain in a very superficial, momentary way that's just reactionary because of what we see on the news. But if we're constantly incarnating ourselves like Jesus did into the lives of our community, we're going to regularly encounter this pain in a deep, meaningful way and be able to actually do something about it. Because you really can't do anything about it, because you see something, you may do a hashtag, you may do some sort of thing, maybe petition or even give to something, but like really boots on the ground. I think that's going to be a key for our churches when we think specifically to our churches going forward, is that they're doing the work of ministry day to day.
Really good, Sam. It makes me think of the image of kind of like sitting back and kind of lobbying things. This is true of even how folks carry out other aspects of faith, that kind of stuff. We stand back and kind of throw things at people and go like, oh, here's good news, but I'm not going to enter into your.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right.
thinking of Jesus going into the leper colony while all the religious leaders around him are saying, no, don't do
That's
that.
right.
And entering in and yeah, the priority of worship of God and then relationship with folks created in his image. What a beautiful picture you just painted of guarding against a potential of coming and going, being tossed to and fro by every wave, is how Paul writes it, this kind of stuff, because it's just news cycles that rise and fall, and our boat just goes up and down. There's nothing sustainable about that.
That's right.
But Jesus pushes over those barriers and those dividing walls, not because of stats, but because they're human, created in God's image.
I got to share a killer quote I heard yesterday from John Tyson quoting someone else. Okay, so I'm going to butcher it so someone in the comments can say it rightly. But he says, we know everything about things that we can do nothing about. And we know very little about the things that we can do something about. In other words, so we don't know our neighbors, which we can actually do something about.
Right.
Our families, our kids, we ignore what's going on in our kids' hearts, our the people at work. We can actually do something. We can actually see them. We can actually help them. We can support them financially, emotionally, spiritually. We can do all these things. And yet we ignore those people right in front of us that we can actually do something about. And we put all of our energy about things that we can't even do anything about. And then we run a while with hearts full of anxiety. Not to say we can't care about things globally and nationally, and we shouldn't vote and all this stuff, but I'm just saying that the emphasis is tilted towards things that we can't really do anything about except prayer, pray about, and maybe just be anxious about. Anyway, someone can correct me.
That's an excellent thought to think on, and how we make decisions and what we're actually investing our time and energies in. And I just had this random thought in addition to that, and what you said before, of how we view sin as the church, or as ministers of reconciliation. It cannot be that it's a problem for them, like it's their issue. Right. And I think when we draw in, we don't just become more familiar with someone's experience and someone's struggles, but we're more aware of our own and our need for the gospel. And I think racism in particular it cannot be an abstraction. It has to be a disease. We have to see it as something that's infecting all of us so that we can rightly address it with truth. Satan has used it as a weapon to divide the church historically, and he's still doing it because we just allow it to lie dormant until it flares up again. And we have to examine things beyond symptoms. Like, we have to really get at the root of the disease. And I think justice as a biblical gospel implication thing is what we address it with. And so it's more complicated always as we lean in. And it's easy to stay back and be lazy because we don't want the uncomfortable feelings. We don't want the complications.
Yeah, and it's the leper image is just not leaving, because like we all have a them. Like everyone has a comfort zone that people would surround us and say, don't leave this comfort zone. We all have a them. We all have someone that Jesus would model, like whoever the them is for each of us. That's who he goes to. Some folks are starting to post questions. Want to move forward to look at the future a little bit. And Atanasio didn't get to answer the last question, so you can start on this next one if you want to. What would it look like to really see? And we've already started to go into this path with some of what was just shared. But what would it really look like to truly empathize and to truly bear burdens and really love? Especially, what would that look like if going through these last few months hasn't really changed us? Is there an ability to empathize, bear burdens, love, if true change, heart change hasn't taken place?
I'll just throw a framework real quick, because as you guys are saying all of this, one of the things that's kind of interesting to me is that, being in Mexico, here we kind of know that there are some things that we're just going to battle with. We have a decent theology of suffering because the world is not perfect, and some things will just be. So I guess the caution for my American bros and sisters is, there are some things that we can't we can't fix. And I think in general, Americans are very used to being able to fix everything.
Good.
The war on XYZ, like that never happens down here. We don't have wars on stuff like hashtag we've only won one. So the point being is like there might be a season of having to carry some things and enter into people's suffering and carrying that long term without being able to fix it, right? And that's our hope in Jesus. The lepers, Jesus healed some of them, right? But at the end of the day, some of them would continue to be lepers. So the point of it is also understanding how we're going to love our neighbors, how we're going to carry this burden. It might not be fixable this side of eternity. And that should help us long for the kingdom of Jesus where that won't exist. Anyways, just random thoughts there.
That's a very helpful thought, and it fits well with the American narrative. You know, the gospel we preach, and historically the American church has preached, is more about the individual, because the individual problems seem easier to grasp and to address. And that's a part of the American dream: exceptionalism, triumphalism, nationalism. It's hard for us to see it as anything else. And so it's not that we have a gospel hope. We have a hope that we're going to be what the American dream told us we're going to be. And that's an idol that we need to take down. And that's very much linked with what we're talking about, these needs for racial justice. So yeah, good word, man.
Yeah, other thoughts? What could it look like going forward for folks to really, really, truly empathize, really, truly bear burdens, really, truly love?
I want to, one of the things that our church is called All People's Church. And one of the things that we always try to clarify with new members is, hey, that doesn't mean ethnic diversity only. It means all kinds of diversity, age, economically, personality. And if we can train our people to be so saturated, using the word saturate, by the gospel and what God has done to us, he wants to do through us. Okay, I'm just throwing out some Vanderstillisms. But that it will transcend merely racial differences. And being able to create those instincts to move towards different, move towards strange or weird or not like me or painful, will create a people who can incarnate into all kinds of different situations. So maybe your situation, like my situation is really diverse in Minneapolis, but maybe your situation is only diverse economically, right? Or class-wise, but racially everyone looks the same, right? And so just building those instincts to enter into pain and enter into someone who's not like you, because God has done that to us, I think really sets us up long-term to be able to, as a church, be able to kind of chameleon into all kinds of different situations and people groups. We have a huge native population here. No one talks about natives, right? Right now, it's all about Black lives, which is important, and we don't want to forget that. But if you train your people to only focus on one kind of group, then you're going to limit the ability to connect with all kinds of people and how the gospel can incarnate to them. So that's just something that we're really trying to emphasize, is that if we are so moved by the gospel, then we're going to be able to learn. Because if you are transformed and you love the person, you'll learn. You don't need to read all the books. You can just sit down with them and learn, whether that's a native person or a Black person or someone who's elderly, and you have a very young church. So we're just trying to really build that as the culture so that we can transcend whatever the cultural moment is.
That's good. Yeah, culture building, giving people the tools they need to address issues wherever they may arise. That's what I think we need. The gospel compels us. Belief in the gospel compels us to love people, not just souls. So everyone has a soul, but people have different experiences. People have different bodies. They look different. They experience the world differently. So putting in the work to understand some of that, I think, is necessary. And then truly believing the gospel. One thing you're saying, Sam, I think is key. It's not like we're pursuing diversity for diversity's sake. There's help. We're healthier with diversity, and we want to be unified, but we don't even pursue unity for unity's sake.
That's right. That's right.
We're pursuing Jesus, and
Amen.
if we're rightly believing the gospel, if we're rightly doing the work to throw off the things that entangle us, then we have, as a result, a unity that looks diverse.
That's right.
Because we're all united around the same things. And if you
Amen.
have if you're not diverse, then it's likely you have some idols that you need to address. And and maybe your
Yeah.
context isn't diverse enough, and so that's been your kind of default. But the reason your context isn't diverse is because there's idols in the culture around you. Like there's reasons why neighborhoods are white and neighborhoods are black. Like we need to examine those things. How does the gospel address that stuff?
That's good. That's good.
And then also in creating that culture of justice, there's this idea that wrong things are wrong and right things are right. And I think we need to just all together have more humility. Nobody has it all figured out. No one is doing it perfectly. And so if we can have these open conversations and maybe even risk getting something wrong, then we can make better progress. Transformation is the aim. Change is the aim. But if you think you're right, if you think you've arrived, you're not going to be sanctified. You can't be. Jesus makes things better, and so we need him. And so that means it's going to be hard work. There's a history, there's society, there's psychology, there's theology. There's a lot involved in this work as ambassadors for another kingdom. And the more we accept the things of this kingdom, of this world, the further we're going to get from representing the right one. So it's my personal thought that every white pastor in our racially divided nation needs to, at some point, have been pastored by a non-white person. And you can fill those white and black or whatever. You can fill in that with every wealthy pastor needs to be pastored by someone that's poor, or whatever you want. But there needs to be a submitting to something that doesn't say, like, if you're not submitting yourself to something different, then you're saying, maybe not with words, but you're saying, I've got it all. I've figured it out. I have everything I need. And that's just a dangerous place to be. And people are dying in the streets. This is real. It's not just some distant thing. There's a need for us to lean in and be uncomfortable and try some things differently. And I just don't know why anyone wouldn't when we're looking at the world this way. So, I mean, you asked a question that was kind of answered in that way, but to name specific things, I think we need to lament more. 40% or like almost half of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. Why are we not lamenting more? So if you want to just preach the word, preach Psalms of lament. Be there for a long time. Teach your people what it means to admit things are broken and see the gospel address it. We need to study biblical identity more so we stop identifying with things in this world. And we need to understand that in community, not just individualized. What does it mean to have a gospel community, not just an individual that's saved? And we need to teach justice from the prophets, and particularly the minor prophets, because they're speaking to a culture that's not unlike the American culture that has all these idols and all these ways of seeking hope that it's not going to be found in the world. And so they address it. They speak truth to it. And we need to teach a framework of shalom and what it looks like to have all things made whole as much as they can be until Jesus comes and makes it all right. And specifically address injustice with that, and then use it in applications, like make it less about personal things and more about corporate things and communal things. Seek balance, like we mentioned earlier, and make sure that every sermon addresses this most specific and most particular thing, because interpretation is one thing, but application is a completely different thing. So how are you applying these truths? Consider your presuppositions. Consider your people, consider your context. How does it need to be applied? Because it doesn't always, and this might be a word for somebody special, but it doesn't always have to be, there's good people on both sides. That doesn't have to be your application. Sometimes it needs to be, these people need the attention, these people need the focus. I'm only going to talk about the evil I see right here. I think that's necessary, and I think that's biblical. And then maybe you can add in a few other things for whatever makes you comfortable. But yeah, it's there's a lot to it. It's hard to say it all in this amount of time, but
sure, that's good. That's
things to be done. Yeah,
so helpful and tangible. The tangibleness, you just brought it out of the kind of ether, which I hope has been a theme through this conversation. It's not about stats. It's about neighbors. It's not about just kind of this idea. What you just gave, Kendrick, is real tangible for church leaders. One of the questions that came in through the Q&A takes another step toward tangible. It's from Gavin. Have you guys tried to stay in God's word alone on Sunday mornings? I'm assuming this is for preachers in your gatherings, or have you spoken to current events? And if yes to the current events, how have you spoken about it?
well, I'll go because I've only preached one time in the midst of all this. I don't have a church right now. I was a guest preacher. and they were in Proverbs. And so I preached Proverbs, and I was able to do that in a way. We talk about wisdom as opposed to being a fool or a scoffer or a simple, the naive. And so I was able to do that in a way that very much linked to the application, so it's not that you have to preach passages that are just about justice, but it's that you should put every effort you can to connect with whatever current cultural climate there is with the application of it. So that's an easy application. What is wisdom in the midst of a pandemic? What is wisdom in the midst of racial tensions? And then that's where the gospel comes to be applied to whatever it is you're experiencing. So that's what I did that one time I preached.
Yeah, that's good. I think just to piggyback on that, there's an older gentleman in our church who's realizing how his ignorance, these are his words, not mine, how his ignorance has just blinded him to some of this kind of stuff. And it's just it's such a humility in him, and to see him work through the scriptures just with a few months of conversation. And like he brought, the book of James to us. He was like, I was reading through James the other day, talking about, you say to the rich person, sit here, and the poor person, sit here. And I've always read that only as a rich and poor divide. But he said the Spirit just started stirring in him to go like, what other, divides do I say? You say here, you say here, in his own mind. And you mentioned Psalms of Lament, and that things don't have to be specifically, the Cornelius passage, the Acts 13 of the multi-ethnic church leadership. Those are amazing, but it's not limited to just that. Thinking through these other biblical themes of favoritism, any ism, right, is going to have overlap into this, and this is what my friend Mike was realizing. So it's not separating necessarily cultural issues from the scriptures. It's going, how does the scriptures lead to and address this? I think that's what you were saying, Kendrick.
Yeah. So for All People's Church, we have just been continuing to preach through Luke, but we did have one of the nights for MCs. All our MCs meet on Wednesday. We canceled all our MCs and we met at the park, and we had my friend Shalom and his wife Tunisia, a Black church. He's a pastor of a Black church. Come and do a panel on race and injustice and police brutality and so forth. So they addressed our church, and then that following Sunday we opened the pulpit up and he preached. And initially he was going to preach on race again, and I said, I just felt a check from the Lord saying, no, don't tokenize him. Like, he can handle the word. So I said, brother, why don't you just preach whatever you feel like God put on you? And he just preached the gospel, and he just called our people to repent, and touched on race a little bit, didn't really go into that. And then what we've done is we have a midweek podcast that we infrequently post, where we can address social or hot topic issues, so that we don't have to like kind of do it's like some crazy gymnastics with the text trying to make it fit something, but we can just address it. So we did one on systemic racism and then one on redlining, and we're just continuing to do it. And then we also have in our corporate prayers, pastoral prayer, we do that during the gathering. We've been praying for that. And then we're partnering with this Black church more. They had me preach at their church a couple weeks ago, and then this Sunday we're celebrating their 7-year anniversary as churches. So we're doing all this partnership. So what we're trying to make sure that the word is like the anchor and the ballast, and because we're preaching through Luke, we're able to apply it in many different ways in the social context that we have right now in our states. But we're just, we're going to keep going. And one of the things that we've said in the very beginning is we're not going to be reactionary and be like, oh, everyone's talking about this, we're going to talk about this. We've been saying, hey, we're in here for the long run. God has placed us in Minneapolis for such a time as this. We're not going to just get onto the bandwagon and then forget it. So like we just posted a podcast last week on redlining. It's like, wow, you're like 2 months late. Well, no, this is still an issue. We're not going to just like stop talking about it because everyone else stops talking about it. So we've been trying to take a very long, steady approach and not just be like, we got to do something and I got to assuage my guilt to feel like I'm doing it enough. But we're going to just keep trucking along, just faithfully plodding along and caring. So that's kind of how we're doing it.
And Sam, just for, if there's any unawareness, will you just 2-second definition of redlining, just to make sure that everybody's hearing you?
2-second definition. Redlining is a reality that happened starting around the 1930s with effects that are affecting us now, that were both political on both sides of the political spectrum, that as well as social, where home associations and so forth created policies and enacted different measures that basically divided the city up into certain quadrants based off of desirability, amenities, and so forth. And so those who were, historically Black neighborhoods basically were unable to move out of the situation. They weren't able to get certain loans that other people were able to get. There's a lot of cultural, really the broader thing is housing income inequality. And those effects are still happening. If you look at the divisions back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and you look at a map today, many cities look almost identical. People who live there now live there still. And with that, there was all these issues where people would scare people out. Hey, Black people are moving in. You should sell it to us. And then they would sell it to them, to these sharks. And then they would sell it to Black people for exorbitant prices. There's just all this wicked, evil stuff done by politicians and done by people are complicit. It's a big issue that doesn't happen legally anymore, but the effects are still being deeply felt, and the generational wealth that was missed out on generations of Black people are still disadvantaging them today.
Yeah.
That was not 2 seconds, but
hey, it's worth it to dive in a little bit. And the reality of that is so pervasive and so ignored still. Anyway. We're starting to wrap up. I want to give you guys each just opportunity to, if there's any kind of burning thoughts, if there's anything that you want to, or you feel like the Spirit might want you to share. But for me, one of the things that's been really helpful, Brian Loritz is a pastor who has, he's long said and still does kind of a mantle to try to be a bridge across different divides, especially in the Black and white world. And I was on a webinar with him. I was receiving a webinar from him that he was on with one of our partner organizations called Exponential. And he got a question that was, what do you say to focused people in this? And it goes back to some of what we've already talked about on this.
Can you say that one more time? It broke up for just a second.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Brian Loritz was asked in this webinar, what would you say to cause-focused people who are just causes?
Yeah.
So again, like we've already talked about, Jesus or justice. What would you say to folks who are more cause-focused? And Brian Loritz was one of the first, in my own ignorance, several years ago now, was one of the first voices to help me realize my naivete and my small worldview and this kind of stuff. And so he's been an occasional mentor from afar, one of the first voices that I heard that's really had an impact on me in learning about this over the years. And his answer was let everything you do orbit around the gospel, because if it's just a cause, there's nothing that will pull it together in a sustainable way over time. And that was just again a really helpful, as we're considering, hey, we're 3 months, I don't even know how to say it. We're not 3 months into this thing. We're not 3 months after this thing. We're 3 months past some overt realities, bringing to the surface this thing that has gone on in both subtle and overt ways for as long as any of us can remember. And has already been referenced by some of you, like if this person pulls you into something, that means you can easily be pulled back out of it. If this person demands your attention and your money or this kind of stuff for one night or $10 or whatever it is, then that's all it is, and it's just catharsis at that point. And there's the danger, right? Is that we can just kind of slap a Jesus label on something that is cathartic and not lasting, and forget that it's not Jesus or justice. It's the perfect just one of the universe who overcame the most unjust thing in the entire world, implicitly and explicitly leads us to these things. So let all we do be orbit around the gospel, because if it's just a cause, there's nothing that will pull it together in a sustainable way over time, was what Pastor Brian said. So final thoughts from any of you?
Be a bridge, brothers and sisters, be a bridge. And I heard this the other day, if you're going to be a bridge, you have to be willing to be walked on by both sides. And I see too much polarization, and people are not fair. They don't shoot their own camp when their camp is out of line, and they only highlight the negatives of the other camp. Be somebody that people cannot figure out what you are. Like, wait, I don't get it. You just said this, and then you said this. Like, you're not allowed to do that, right? And I'm reading through Compassion and Conviction or whatever by Ann Campaign, that new book by Gibney just came out. And one of the things he says, do not let them frame the conversation. They'll say, do you care about poor people, or do you care about healthy economics, right? Yes, right. Don't let them create the either ors. Like, force people to be befuddled by how nuanced you are. Like, be so nuanced people can't handle it, right? Like, because you'll be calling out Trump one day and then another day say, actually, that was actually a good thing by Trump. People are like, no, you're not. You can only say negative things by him, or Biden, or anything like that. Just be like confusing. Oh, no, actually, that shooting makes a little more sense. You can't compare it exactly to this situation here. Don't make it the same thing and whitewash everything, or not whitewash. Shouldn't use that word right now. Broad brush everything, right? Like, be nuanced, brothers and sisters, and be willing to be shot at. And I think my wife has said this recently. She's like so afraid to write certain things on her social media because immediately people are going to say, oh, you're this. And be okay with being called out, right? Like, woe to you when all men speak well of you. And so be okay to be shot by your own camp and by the other camp if we're using those kind of polarizing terminologies. Yeah. And I just think it's really important for us being willing to be the peacemakers and being walked on, and being okay. So, yeah.
That's good, man. I think a good addition to that is have safe spaces too. Because when you're alienated from both sides, you feel alone. It's not good to be alone. So don't be the only person building the bridge, but have a lot of people with you, and you can share that sentiment. The AND campaign, I second that. They're really good at doing that work, especially politically. I also think we should do really well to celebrate grace and celebrate ethnicity, celebrate culture, learn about other things, not just as a voyeur, but or a spectator, but like really go into it wanting to understand and empathize, and then you'll be able to celebrate and enjoy the good things, but also feel the pain and the suffering and the difficulties of that. We mentioned a couple times, or I did, we need to heal from trauma. We need to really understand what that means, because if we don't, it manifests itself whether you want it to or not. And there are some people who are just now becoming aware of it, and they're leaving churches, but some of them are leaving the faith. And these are my friends, and I'm very burdened for them right now because they don't have a home. Like, they don't feel anyone really knows them. They're not hating Jesus. They're hating white Jesus. And so I want them to know the real Jesus, and we need to work together to do that. So I will use the term whitewash. We need to stop whitewashing our faith. And that means we need to be educated. So keep learning. Don't stop learning. There's podcasts, there's books. I'm not gonna recommend any. I want you to go and look for them. I want you to be invested in it. It's so necessary that we desire to see this, that we desire to socialize or diversify our social lives, and not just our churches, but that we would see, like, there's people outside of the church even that we need to learn and know as long lost brothers and sisters, that we could befriend them and hope that God would save them and bring them into the family. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Amen. I would just add to that. This is a marathon. Take a break. Disconnect, yes. Relax. Jesus is still King. He will return and make all things better. So there are some things we're not going to fix. So give some grace. This side of the border, I'm tired, is exhausted. I can't imagine what it's like to be in the thick of it. So just rest, I guess, is the word I want to share.
Amen. Amen. So as already has been mentioned, this conversation did not cover everything. Turns out we've not dug into every nuance. It's one piece, just like our first conversation 3 months ago was, just like many other resources are, but hopefully a helpful piece. And guys, thank you for catching us up, giving us some of what you're experiencing, some of what you've been learning, and helping us look to the future, both the immediate future, and we didn't even get into, how this overlaps with the political season that we're in, but immediate future, and then long-term, our eternal hope as well. But thank you for today. Resources continue to be posted at saturatetheworld.com, including on this topic and the intersection, not the pushing away, but the bringing together of Jesus and justice. Jesus and justice, just to make sure I say that clearly. And then in a couple of weeks, we're going to start into a series of webinars for the fall that we are calling Church of the Future, recognizing that on one hand, it feels like COVID has changed everything. But on the other hand, increasing amounts of people think that COVID, similar to our conversation today, COVID is really just shining a light on a trajectory that our culture and that our churches have been on. And so from September through November, our webinars will be designed to help navigate some of those changes: discipleship, equipping, community, all the different aspects of church as we know it. And rather than see it as a disparaging one, we can see that season as a hopeful one as well, as God shapes his people. So that'll kick off on September 15th with Daniel Yang. And RSVP is open today for Church of the Future. But for today, thank you guys. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us. I'm really grateful. And would God continue the good work that he started in each of us in this area of life and faith and godliness, and in every as well.
Amen.
Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, brothers. Let's get it to you.